so we are going to start our panel discussion. It's scheduled for an hour, and we'll do that. And then I'll just cut the next break a little shorter, and we should be finishing very close to on time then. So let me turn this over to Ralph. And Ralph, you have it, and you got a good panel there. So.
I do. I have a number of learned men. I'm super excited. I'll do some quick introductions of our panelists, and then we'll get on with it. Tom Gilbert, who you've already met earlier today, is the author of the critically acclaimed "How Baseball Happened: Outrageous Lies Exposed, the Truth Revealed," which won the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of 2020, which Peter already told you. Tom's other works include Baseball and the Color Line, Roberto Clemente, and Playing First. And from his Greenpoint, Brooklyn stoop, he can throw a baseball to the former site of the Manor House Tavern, where members of the Eckford Baseball Club enjoyed a post-game drink in the 1850s. David Dyte is an adopted Brooklynite, originally from Australia, and for some reason is a Dodger fan. He specializes in tramping around the borough and taking photographs of places where ball fields once thrived. The fruits of his labor can be seen at brooklynballparks.com, a website that I visit frequently in my research. And if you haven't been there yet, you definitely should go. Bill Ryczek has written 7 books on baseball history, including a trilogy on 19th century ball. Baseball's first inning, the first leg of the trilogy, covers the period from baseball's beginnings through the Civil War. Bill, John Thorne, and Joanne Hulbert did a broadcast recreation of the classic 1870 Red Stockings Atlantic game, the highlights of which can be seen on YouTube, and the full version will be available as soon as I get off my ass and finish putting it together. Bill has been a SABR member since 1984. Gentlemen, thank you very much for participating today. And let's roll right into it. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, just one piece of if everyone want to go to speaker view, then you'll because there will be a panel discussion, and then you can pick it up from that. And then also use the chat button, and we'll go over that at the end.
Everybody, the first Brooklyn and Kings County adult baseball clubs that we know much about were organized in the mid-1850s. Which was, a little late to the game at that point. What was the state of baseball? And when we say baseball in this conversation, we specifically mean the New York game at that point, and how much progress had baseball actually made towards becoming the national sport? And Tom, why don't you kick this off?
Well, I think it made very little progress toward becoming a national sport in 1854 when the Excelsiors were founded. I tell the story in my book about the different routes that baseball took to Brooklyn. The conventional narrative is that things emanated from the Knickerbockers, which is not really true. I was intrigued by some of the things Dr. Campanella said, because it's connections back and forth across the East River that really are the context for this. So the Atlantics come out of a public market. And the public market culture, which has an old relationship to baseball, older than we know, there's interactions between markets in Brooklyn and markets in Manhattan. You can see some of the same names, some of the same merchants moving from one to another. And these people they were prosperous, the butchers in particular. They were prosperous and they had leisure, although not upper class by anyone's definition, but they loved sports and they were early formers of baseball clubs. Then you have the Eckfords. These are the first clubs in Brooklyn I'm talking about. The Eckfords are a product of the fact that the shipyards were moving from Corlear's Hook across the river into Greenpoint and Williamsburg, simply because they were running out of space. So those two clubs are not descendants from the Knickerbockers in any way, which is what's interesting about them. There's one club that the Knickerbockers actively helped form, and that was the suburbanites who moved from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn Heights, and they formed the Excelsiors in 1854. And these people are very connected to the Knickerbockers. Some of them are actual cousins of the Knickerbockers, and they acknowledge the Knickerbockers as their parent club. But I guess later in the discussion, we'll talk about what happened, because the Knickerbockers weren't terribly interested in spreading baseball. They did help form the first baseball convention in '57 and the National Association, as it was called, which is in a way a statement of ambition because it wasn't national at all. The other bat and ball games in America, none of them ever formed a national association. But the Excelsiors are the team that was had a plan to spread baseball and actively tried to move the ball in that direction and make baseball a national sport.
Bill, why was Brooklyn so late to the party? You know, it had been the baseball had been gaining in momentum for, you know, nearly a decade at that point. Why was Brooklyn joining the party so late? You might be muted right now. Double check. Yeah, you're muted right now, Bill. Thanks. There we go. Perfect.
Hi, Bill.
Oh, hello, everyone. As to why they were late to the game, I don't know. You know, New York was there first, but if you think of they weren't really playing great baseball. And if you think of the Knickerbockers, who really left a record and are the most noted New York team, the Knickerbockers we remember are people like Doc Adams, William Wheaton, Grinnell, people who were not known as baseball players. They were known for their officership with the club. Whereas when we had the Brooklyn clubs get started, the people we remember from the Brooklyn club are the players. You had, Dr. Jones from the Excelsiors, you had Thomas Tassi and maybe Pete O'Brien, but that really shifted from administration to playing. And if you look at when the Brooklyn teams came in, all the best teams are from Brooklyn. You had a few New York teams like the Gothams and the Eagles. They were not the top teams. You had the Excelsiors, the Atlantics, and the Eckfords. Those were the dominant teams of that era, all from Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's fascinating how quickly it happened, right? I mean, I guess I wonder, and this is that town ball comment that I made earlier today, Tom, how like in Philadelphia was a little bit later coming to the game because they had such a thriving town ball scene, right? And there was that direct competition always to battle against New York, right? Like all of the other cities always sort of had this second banana syndrome to New York City. It wasn't just Brooklyn, but Boston had its own thing and Philadelphia had its own thing, and so there was a resentment, sort of fighting against the idea of adopting these things that New York City people did. And I'm wondering if that was the case in Brooklyn as well, because Brooklyn had this thriving cricket scene.
Well, Brooklyn, I think baseball was a solid part of Brooklyn culture. I mean, when these clubs are formed that we're talking about, it's really an organizational model. It's not the game that's crossing the river. They're forming clubs that are like the Knickerbockers. This was sort of the coming thing in baseball, to form a formal club like that. The Atlantics were preceded by a pickup game. But what you were saying about Philadelphia, what's interesting to me about Philadelphia and Boston, who had their own bat and ball games, is they didn't have the ambition. So yeah, there was some resistance to a New York game coming in, but it collapsed really quickly, especially in Philadelphia. And there's no agenda for those games to spread, whereas the New Yorkers are trying to spread the game. There's no, athletics don't go on a road trip trying to promote town ball in New Jersey or Ohio, right? But the Excelsiors go on the road. And I think, with all the interaction, the baseball influence was going one way. And I think town ball was a game, as was the Massachusetts game. And people watched it, but there's slightly different cases in both cases. But what really distinguishes New York and Brooklyn is the ambition of the game.
Now, Tom, if I can ask you, what role do you think the New York media played? Because most of the national sports journals were based in New York. The Clipper, Wilkes Spirit of the Times, Supporter Spirit of the Times, and they spread the New York game. Do you think that had, there were no Boston, Philadelphia papers that were really proselytizing?
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely was a big factor. But, what surprised me when I was going into that, when I was researching my book, I was surprised by how much, there's no question that this is basically true, that the New York sports weeklies were the national sports weeklies were mostly published in New York, and they were very influential. And the rest of the country was following things like the Brooklyn-New York rivalry as outsiders, but with interest. But what surprised me is how much information there is in those sports weeklies in the 1850s of the other bat and ball games. because I think they printed whatever people sent them. You know, there's lots of stuff about the Massachusetts game, lots of stuff about town ball, lots of stuff about cricket, even sports we don't even understand, like what was it called? Le Cat in New Orleans. We don't even know what that was, but there are box scores. So I actually think that ultimately the most important factor, they weren't selling something that was hard to sell. They were selling something that people were interested in. And, you know, New York's power is hard to underestimate culturally and economically and every other way. But it was more than that. It was that baseball had an agenda to go national. And I think it's not written down, but it's explicit from and easily deduced from the behavior of these clubs. For instance, you know, the most obvious one being the Excelsior's road trip that was followed by other road trips. You know, to me, that's an effort to spread the game.
And
David.
the fact that they called whoever the best team in New York was, they called them the champion club of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you look at Philly, in 1859, there's town ball clubs all over the place. In 1861, it's a dinosaur. I mean, that's quick. You wonder why more resistance wasn't put up.
And within 4 years after that, you had the Athletics arcing up about how the Atlantics were ducking them and they should be champions of the world.
That's true. I mean, Philadelphia quickly rivals Brooklyn as a producer of baseball talent, you know, more than Boston.
David, sort of leaping off that idea of the rivalry, how important was that inter-city rivalry between New York City and Brooklyn to the rise of baseball? With New York serving as this epicenter, right? Clearly, that rivalry of these two cities so close to each other, it was important.
I think that goes as far as maybe the fashion racecourse games. And at that point, Brooklyn may have had more better teams. New York was able to put together a better all-star squad. After that, you rapidly start to see suddenly the Atlantics are champions year after year. When a challenger comes to them, and I don't know, Tom might pull me up on this, I feel like the Eckfords, because they were shipbuilders, perhaps more of a working class club compared to.
Yeah, I wouldn't quite go that far, but that's a complicated topic.
Yeah. But it was certainly, they were a different part of Brooklyn. There was some rivalry there. They were thrilled to get the championship for 2 years themselves. It started to become an intra-Brooklyn thing pretty fast to me after that fashion racecourse series.
Oh, that's true.
I think the other thing that happened in Brooklyn, and this was partly Chadwick's doing, was there was not just an interest in advancing the game by spreading it around, but an interest in advancing the game by improving the rules. And I've been involved personally in roller derby in the last 15 years. And it's gone through a similar phase. It's been fascinating to watch. At the end of the season, everyone gets together. What's working? What's not? How are people taking advantage of strange loopholes? And you had some clubs. So we had what we called the bound rule, where if you caught the ball on one bounce, that was an out. Runners could still advance. They didn't have to tag up. So it was a little less than catching it on the fly. But there were clubs that felt that was a huge unfair advantage to the muffin players. And they should play what they called, but the fly rule wasn't the official rule, but teams got together and played games that way. The Star did and the Excelsior did. And we can see letters they wrote to other teams like the Knickerbockers saying, hey, come play us. We play by the fly rule. And we're going to show everyone how it's a better rule. And that mostly came out of Brooklyn. And then Chadwick would take the results of these meetings and these games, and at the start of each season have prize matches where he would introduce a lot of these experimental rules with sort of Brooklyn All-Star nines playing each other. And he later lost his temper when some of the best teams started refusing to provide their players for these games. But I think that there was this big impetus amongst the Brooklyn clubs to make the game a better sport that better sorted out the finer players and was better for spectators to watch.
I think
I totally agree with that. Go ahead, Bill.
One of the things that, in my opinion, impacted Brooklyn versus New York was the availability of playing sites. Manhattan was being developed. It was going north until the Knickerbockers got squeezed out. And whereas Brooklyn, and one thing that really hurt New York was that they were never able to get use of Central Park. They tried over and over again when it first was built, and they could never get access to it. Whereas Brooklyn, there were more available sites, and they were more conducive to spectators. You look at at Elysian Fields, that was not conducive to large crowds. Union Grounds, Capitol Line, the first two fields, enclosed fields in Brooklyn, and they were the first two anywhere for some time. So I think you had much better playing sites in Brooklyn that were conducive to spectators. The early sites were not, and if you want to spread the game, you have to have a lot of people watching it, and they could watch games most enjoyably in Brooklyn.
David, just jumping back quickly, because you mentioned the fashion racecourse games, and Tom talked about this a little bit in his presentation, but I'm wondering if you can expound on it. Why Queens, right? Like, we understand, Tom mentioned the availability of the space and the current locations in Brooklyn weren't necessarily able to house the anticipated crowd. But why that spot for these games that have now, carried on tremendous importance to 19th century historians, the first All-Star game, the first paid admittance, they've become rather iconic. Why did it end up there?
I think, and I don't have chapter and verse on this, so someone may contradict me. It feels to me like that was an enclosed space where you could charge admission. And so someone could make a buck from that.
And one other thing, horse racing was illegal outside of Queens County, downstate. So the state legislature would grant permission for certain limited territories to have horse racing because they were trying to control gambling. So there was no racetrack in 1858 in Brooklyn. And it was convenient. There was a Long Island Railroad station there too. It's actually right near where Shea was. So I think there was no other better place.
Yeah. If the Union Grounds had existed then, that probably would have been the spot.
Yeah, but I think ultimately these facilities respond to a demand, not create a demand.
Yeah.
Let's go back a little bit to something Tom was bringing up. Why did the Excelsiors and these other Brooklyn clubs call the Knickerbocker Club of New York City the parent of baseball clubs? Bill, can you jump in on that one?
Well, one thing I've always thought about the Knickerbockers is that they did really well was keep records. There were other clubs, John Thorne came across the Magnolias, and there were some other clubs that were earlier, but the Knickerbockers were really good at record keeping, and their records survived. So many times when you look at history, and in baseball history in particular, the people who lived the longest and got to tell their side of the story are the ones that whose view of history prevails. And I think the one thing the Knickerbockers did was keep really good records. And they're still around. You can go back and look at those, and they had the attendance for each practice, who paid their dues, who was delinquent 10 cents in their dues. So they were very serious about what they did. And I think that passed it on, and because everybody knew about them. They knew who they were.
They also marked whenever a player was fined for swearing or any other, if they were late to practice or anything like that. I always love the little notes in the Knickerbocker books, which if you're unaware of, everybody, you can go and look at them at the main branch of the New York Public Library and within the Spalding collection. The first time you visit, they'll make you look on microfilm because they don't trust you. But if you show up often enough, they will actually bring the books out and let you take a peek.
What if you wear like 19th century clothing?
They might have you arrested before you can get up to the Rose Room. I'm not really sure.
One thing I love about that is all the petty bickering that went on. You think of these guys as being, gentlemen, and that's the term that's always used. The petty bickering, and somebody got under somebody's skin, or they were worried about somebody stole a ball from someone's locker, or they opened the locker, or this how much of the debate was on little petty personal differences.
Yeah, Tom, do you have any thoughts about that idea of the?
Well, I have two. One is, I think Bill's point, which is a great point, raises the question of whether the Knickerbockers' importance has been exaggerated, simply because we know so much about them. The Knickerbockers, as you know, they were fierce believers in amateurism, and they refused to take gate money, and they refused to participate in professional baseball. It's kind of ironic that, remember James White Davis? You remember him? So years later, he's an old man and he doesn't have enough money to pay for a nice burial plot. And he decides that him and his other Knickerbockers are owed something by professional baseball. It was the thing they shunned. I think they had an exaggerated sense of their own importance that they may have convinced a few people. James White Davis, he wanted the National League, the players, to be assessed a certain amount of money to pay for his grave. And none of them had any idea who he was, I'm sure.
Well, we ended up paying for his grave, so we took care of him.
Thank you, SABR
Yeah,
members.
I mean,
Thank you for
I'm
that.
sure he's happy. He stopped spinning about a year ago.
One thing you have to remember about the Knickerbockers is that they weren't very good players. You know, they certainly weren't anywhere near the caliber of the Atlantics, the Eckfords, the Excelsiors.
Right. They fought against the intra-club matches for the longest time until, you know, they sort of had to concede and play other teams. And as soon as they started doing that, they lost almost every.
Yeah, they were very
time.
picky about who they played.
Yeah.
No, I agree with Eric there that they had some really good players, but I think the Knickerbockers are complicated because they're internally divided about how competitive they want to be. It seems to me.
But,
You know, you have Napoleon Bonaparte McLaughlin, you have Harry Wright for a brief period, you have Wadsworth, you have some really good athletes. In 1858, three of them were put on the All-Star team that won.
Right.
But I think there was actually internal divisions about how far they wanted to go, whereas their descendant club, the Excelsiors, are going all out. Right, Dr. Jones and his club. You know, we've already talked about a few Brooklyn firsts, but how about youth teams being used as farm teams, weightlifting, you know, really scientific training and player development, recruiting.
Yeah, under the table payments to get Creighton from the start.
I think not only it wasn't just that they paid him, and they, you know, you could argue about exactly how they did it and what it meant, but I believe they moved him across the East River. You know, they helped his father get a house. And this is something I discovered looking at land records. You know, Flanley, he was a telegrapher. They got him a better job in the Brooklyn Police Department. You know, they would probably defend this as not being professionalism, but still they were very aggressive about acquiring talent. You know, they got Leggett by merging with another team. So, you know, they're much more interested in competition than their parent.
From the National Association, they've turned their back on all of that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I don't know whether that was just sulking because they weren't that good anymore.
You're talking about the Excelsiors?
Interesting letter from Frank Pidgeon that he wrote to the press at one point about the evils of professionalism, which sort of lays out, and it was the last dying gasp, but why people should not play baseball for money. And it was an interesting perspective. You know, basically that if why a gentleman would never want to be compensated.
Yeah, you know, this is a really complicated question, and to me, it's the attitudes about what's on the wrong side or the right side of line of amateurism are really subtle sometimes, and in our lifetimes, they've changed, right? If you look at who's allowed in the Olympics right now, it's completely different from when I was a kid, and I think these things change with time, and they're really difficult the line can be difficult to pin down, especially historically.
It's also the history of say a sport like soccer, where like incredibly dominant early teams like Aldertonians still exist in a strictly amateur sense, but they're not even affiliated with the Football Association anymore. And if they went into the FA Cup, they'd be beaten 10-0 by the lowliest team that enters that tournament now. Yeah. The amateur pro schism in Britain was even greater, and
I find that even more confusing.
Yeah.
Well, we see the remnants of that mentality still existing in today, right? You see it in fans who complain about baseball player salaries. You see it as, you know, minor leaguers are being paid poverty wages, and so much of the pushback from the public is, well, they should just be happy that they're playing the game in the first place, right? That's a descendant of that amateurism mentality that you know has lasted 160 years at this point.
Yep, I agree. It's hard to kill.
Yeah. Brooklyn was late to the game, but at the same time, there were a number of important firsts that happened in Brooklyn. Tom, can you mention one or two of the important Brooklyn
Sure.
firsts?
I mean, the interest in inter-city and inter-club rivalry is a massive first, right? There's just not there with the Gotham's Eagles and Empires. Just nothing happening, and that's really why the game was so obscure and didn't really turn the public on. We obviously have the first ballpark, which is a byproduct of the fact that there were fans who were willing to pay money. That's really the beginning of. I mean, when that happens, when they build the Union Grounds, you can't stop the ball rolling toward professionalism in the first professional league. I mean, it's not stoppable. The stakes are different now, and there's money. David mentioned the most important early baseball journalist who also served on the rules committee, Chadwick, a massive figure and a Brooklynite. How about Creighton, the guy that pioneered modern pitching and some people have called him the first national star, the subject of the first baseball card, but the kind of pitching that was new, that he pioneered, invented, however you want to put it, that's the reason why we have a strike zone. I mean, it's hard to imagine affecting the game much more than that. The first road trips by the Excelsiors. And not to mention the massive reservoir of talent that Brooklyn produced, right? That really kept baseball going through most of the 19th century. If you look at the National Association, when there are no viable Brooklyn teams, there's Brooklynites all over the place. So those are some big firsts.
David, do you have any firsts in particular, if you in regard to your particular specialty of the ballparks themselves? Can you think of any other Brooklyn firsts?
Definitely Union grounds, and then that was relatively rapidly followed by the Capitol Inn grounds that became, again, just a huge venue for paid attendance and renowned for big events. If something was going to happen there, it would be a big deal. There's so much so that in the case of the Capitol Inn grounds now, there's myths about things that happened there that didn't, that people made up subsequently, and we put them at the Capitol grounds because, well, that'll make it more impressive. This myth about Chadwick laid out some stakes and young Goldsmith came and demonstrated the curveball and whatever, and that the Goldsmith family had this this Brooklyn Eagle article that they had in a frame it never happened. That article didn't really exist in the Eagle. But the fact that they put it at the Capitol Inn grounds, this major venue, gave it some credibility and some gravitas that let this myth persist for the better part of a century. I feel like that sort of development of like stadiums, and even Chadwick would complain in articles about if he went to a place and they didn't have a good place set aside for the press. That became a thing in Brooklyn, actually catering to the press. Here, this is where you sit. You're going to get a prime view of the game. You'll have access to the scorers in case you have the card you're keeping, you lose track, all this sort of thing. It starts to look so much more modern through the course of the 1860s than what it had. And then by the time you get to 1870 and the famous game between the last gasp of the Atlantic and the Red Stockings, there are multiple scorecards being kept. The press is all there. There's a gigantic crowd. It's just a big deal in a way that I guess everywhere Cincinnati went, that happened. But they were very specifically built to try to take dominance away from, teams in Brooklyn that had been dominating. Someone else looked at that and said, well, if we just get all the best players.
Like George Wright, for instance.
Yeah, and the game that they're most remembered for is one that they lost, and it happened in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
I ask this next follow-up with a little hesitation because of the point that Tom brought up earlier of the danger of always pinning the first label on something. But I've always been fascinated, if you look at a map of the location of all of the ballparks that were in Brooklyn by Eastern Park, because it's just so far removed from everything else. And in my research, I learned that, that part of that was motivated by a desire by the owners to get people to ride the trolley cars.
And they were promoting real estate development there.
Right, because that was their business. Was that the first park that was sort of, real estate development is a huge part of stadium financing now. Was that the first time that there was something like that where a park was located in a specific place in an urge to spur business?
Well, before David answers that question,
yes, Tom.
Because it's just a little bit out my area. Let me just say that the Elysian Fields were built to attract real estate development, as well as were the ferries. The Stevens made a massive amount of money selling building lots in Hoboken, and that was the main motivator for why they built the ferry to Hoboken, which was a ferry to nowhere, and then they built the Elysian Fields as a park for used for free.
If I might just jump in, many of the early amusement parks began that way too. Amusement parks were often built at the end of the line
Right.
by the traction companies to literally draw people out, to land areas that they had real estate interest in and were trying to develop into residential, what we now think of as the streetcar suburbs.
Yeah, that's true. And, I argue in my book that the Coney Island is in a way a direct descendant of the Elysian Fields.
Hmm.
But
Yeah,
it's a long, twisty
numerous
road.
lifestyle roads down that way that are now our various different subway routes there.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the subway map, it doesn't make any sense if you don't know history, because it doesn't get people where they need to go right now.
It's funny, if you go out to Eastern Park now, it didn't seem to work very well long term. It's all tire yards and
Well, I think that was definitely an effort.
here.
Yeah, it was definitely a real estate motivated thing. And they
Yeah.
returned to the Gowanus area after Eastern Park.
Yeah, and there's a nice quote from Byrne when after the Brotherhood League collapsed, and the Dodgers and the Brooklyn Brotherhood team basically merged. I say Dodgers. I don't think
Yeah.
anyone's called them that yet, but you know what I mean.
We're following you.
And there's a quote from him about, I do not purpose to use my ball club to benefit someone else's real estate interest.
Aha.
But he did end up being persuaded to move out there, I think, just because the Washington Park they were in at the time was in lousy condition. But yeah, I don't think the 7 years they spent there as that were terribly good for them. It was just too far for people to come. It was too far away from population centers, and they ended up coming back to kitty corner from that original Washington Park.
Right. That made more baseball sense.
Bill, any other firsts that we might have missed?
Well, we had the first near riot at a baseball game, which Tom talked about earlier. We had the Excelsior Atlantic game. And I think one of the things that the pointing to the growth of baseball is the fact that gamblers had become so invested in the result. It showed the popularity of the sport. And almost every sport was the subject of gambling in those days. And certainly when the Knickerbockers were starting out, I don't think there were a lot of gamblers. Maybe they had some wagers among themselves, but certainly gamblers didn't follow the Knickerbocker games. The growth of the game in Brooklyn is shown by the interest that the gamblers took in it. And Tom, you talked about that scene earlier, but that never would have happened 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier.
There's a interesting, that episode in 1856 when the Gothams were playing the Knickerbockers, and Joe Pinckney, former Gotham, who had joined the Unions of Morrisania, he shows up in the Gotham's lineup for this rare inter-club match. And the Knickerbockers and the people betting on them go crazy because Pinckney is a star. And there's all kinds of complaining. It's in the sports weeklies and the local papers. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the 1857 convention happened a few months after that. I think people realized that they had to do something to prevent manipulation that was related to gambling.
Interesting.
Yeah, because the Knickerbockers weren't interested in the first attempt to have a convention. They showed up at the second meeting.
All right, I'm going to step through each three of you, yay or nay. Is Brooklyn the birthplace of baseball as a modern sport? Tom?
Okay, whenever this topic comes up, this kind of topic, you have to decide what you mean by baseball. This is a common problem in our field, right? So where did baseball come from? Baseball's been around forever in the biggest sense, right? To me, it's only interesting when it becomes an organized adult sport with ambitions to go national. So yeah, that happened in Brooklyn. If you read my book about Dr. Jones and the whole effort to take it national, there's, you can see the plan. It's not written down, but you can see what they did. And I think that's the most important difference between the New York game and all the other games, and it was a critical difference. But one of the sort of pitfalls of this kind of question in baseball scholarship is we see, there's a mention of baseball in Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, 1798. What is it? You tell me. So the word baseball's been around. And what is the game of baseball? You know, Albert Spalding in 1889, he took those two teams on a world tour trying to promote the game. And he writes, everywhere I went, people are telling me, oh, this is just like rounders, which I played when I was a kid, or the girls play. And this really pissed him off. And he goes to England and he says, oh, I get it. Rounders is a lot like cricket. It's nothing like baseball, but it's sort of a taxonomic thing. You know, what makes baseball? Who played it? How they played it? So I would say, based on what I think is the most important sense of the word, baseball happened in Brooklyn. And without the Brooklyn-New York rivalry and the energy that Brooklyn's brought to it, I'm not sure it would have become the national sport. I think it's an interesting question.
Bill, what do you think? I think Bill may have frozen.
Hey, Bill?
We lost Bill. David, what do you think?
Well, it's difficult to add to everything that Tom just said. I think that the biggest thing to me is these tours. It's the Excelsiors went and showed off the game around the north. The Atlantic went and showed off the game around the north, and this started to generate this from Philadelphia. Suddenly, we got to beat these guys. We're sick of this. We're sick of Brooklyn. We had enough of these Atlantics. We've had enough of these Eckfords. It's our turn. From Cincinnati, it's our turn. Cincinnati doesn't take the whole rail thing and go to San Francisco and all that if the Excelsiors haven't gone up north, if the Atlantic haven't gone up north. And I think, that's just huge that that there was this physical idea of like going out and proselytizing the game and showing off our ability. Go and challenge us. Let's see what you can do. And that the newspapers are one thing, but when you get to go and see a game and see the level of skill on display and marvel at these people, that really inspires everyone. Hey, we can do that too. We can get that good. We can challenge them. And that was really Brooklyn teams that started that.
Bill, you're muted, but what's your take?
All right. Yeah, I disappeared. I dropped off in the middle of Tom's. I'm not sure why, but Tom was talking, so I'm not sure what was said. But he said we have to define what baseball is. We also have to define what birthplace is. And if you say it's certainly the first time baseball was ever played. No, it's not Brooklyn, but where it went from very little to the point where it was poised to become the national game. I think you can make a very good case for Brooklyn. And the question I would ask is, if not Brooklyn, what? If you're going to have a birthplace, the only other possibility I could come up with would be New York. And I think if you compare Brooklyn to New York, Brooklyn is clearly superior in that regard. So I think of all the possibilities. And besides, Brooklyn's a topic of our symposium. So let's roll with Brooklyn.
David Shirt's a nice little argument right there, though.
Yeah, I don't. If people can't see this, it's Brooklyn, and then the rest of the area is labeled out of Brooklyn, as it should be.
Let's collect some questions from the group. Larry McCrae starts it off with: is there an argument that some playing rule or club operation feature arose in Brooklyn and led toward baseball fever? So was there something that sort of initiated in Brooklyn that was specific to the rules or to the clubs that increased that? David, yeah, you have something?
I would certainly argue in favor of the fly rule. That the level of skill that's required in fielding, it dramatically increases when you've got the fly rule, and it really starts to sort in the language of the era. It starts to sort the good ballists from the muffins in a very big way once you've got the fly rule introduced. And I do wish that we had that sort of I think it's an early 1880s variation. I still wish that you could catch foul balls on the mound. There's some spectacular plays to be had there, but within the foul lines, the fly rule was huge in suddenly making the fielding in the game. The elite athletes definitely stood out a lot more.
Now, my recollection,
innovation.
My recollection was that the Knickerbockers were one of the early advocates of the fly rule.
They were, but I think the Excelsior and the Star really made it happen by holding a lot of games under the fly rule and inviting other teams. They'd send letters to other teams, come play us, and we invite you to play under the fly rule, like consistently. They would hold games in defiance of the rule conventions of the day. You see it in the letters of the time.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and I spent a lot of time because I really believe one of the theses of my book is that it was the who, not the what, that was important. It was who was playing and their attitude toward it that really got the ball rolling. But to try to prove the opposite, to test my theory, I spent a lot of time looking for things that you could say were attractive features of the New York game that made it better to someone in Boston or Philadelphia. And I didn't come up with much. The only thing I've ever come up with is, when the Excelsiors went on the road in 1860, and picking up on what David was saying, they were more impressive athletes, but that's because the Brooklyn sports scene was so competitive. Like if they'd been playing, hopscotch, they would have been more impressive. So it wasn't the baseball, it was the people like Creighton and Leggett were magnificent athletes. There's a description of the Excelsiors going to Baltimore and playing their namesake that was formed by friends and business partners of them. And Creighton is pitching against a bunch of guys who were just so far beneath them that it's comical. If you read the Baltimore papers, they say Creighton is tossing the ball up and down, whistling to himself, and then he throws a fastball and the batter doesn't swing till Leggett's already caught it. So this is part of the appeal, that it's so highly developed, but it's so highly developed because stakes were high and there were so many people interested. Mr. Lovett in Boston, that Brian was talking about, he actually said, he talks about being a Boston player of the Massachusetts game, was going to Boston Common to see this New York sport and see what all the fuss is about. The only thing he mentions as something that's more attractive about it, there are two things. The pitching was slow and it was easy to hit because Boston game had fast pitching. And the fact that the ball was more elastic. There's no question about that, because that's why you needed more space to play baseball than town ball or the Massachusetts game. But, I just don't think together all those things add up. And I'm kind of a rules skeptic. We just saw them play with 7-inning baseball games and the world didn't end. I just don't think rules matter that much.
Well, one thing you mentioned earlier, Tom, in terms of things that started in Brooklyn to change the game, was the pitching of Creighton, because that led to a number of rules changes.
Right. That was exciting, and it really did change the game. I don't think you could imagine anyone changing it. I think it dwarfs what Babe Ruth did to the game, if you want to be real about it.
Was Creighton one of the first? I'm not clear on this point, where the rules seem to have been originally intended that it was a fielder's game.
Right.
And I'm sorry if I'm going back to baseball history 101 here. You were just
no, you're going to something that we can't answer.
Loop something into the strike zone that the batter wants to hit, and if he doesn't want to hit,
that was the idea, yeah.
And then we invent strikes and balls to stop the pitcher just boring everyone to death.
The way it happened was somehow Creighton figured out a way within the rules to pitch faster. But Henry Chadwick always said it wasn't just the speed. Chadwick always said, well, speed is, velocity, schmalocity. The people in Boston throw really fast from 45 feet away and the hitters still hit it. He said it was movement, command, and speed. Well, that's what modern pitching is. So I think it was something like modern pitching. And I'm going to talk about this during my tour, so I don't want to totally tell it all. But the truth is, it's a mystery, and I don't think it's a solvable mystery exactly what he was pitching. We do know that it was dominating, that people couldn't handle it, that he had this combination of velocity and command. Was he throwing a breaking ball? I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. But somehow, and then, a lot of our fellow historians have assumed that he was cheating, because they don't understand how under the rules, which said you had to throw dead underhand with no wrist snap. Eric is talking about Joe Sprague, who also threw fast. But Creighton initiated a whole movement toward this new kind of pitching. We're not sure what it was, and we're not sure whether it was cheating or not. People like Chadwick and Pete O'Brien looked at it and said it's legal.
There's a good description from someone that says when he left pitches low, they were hittable, and when they were high, they were almost unhittable.
That makes you wonder whether it was some kind of breaking pitch to me. But
Well,
maybe
you
it
go
just
back-
had more life on it up.
You go back to the late 1850s, you hear references to other swift pitchers. Creighton was not the only one who was throwing hard. He just somehow did it better than everybody else.
Yeah, that's why I say pioneer, because we don't know exactly what they're doing. We don't know who did it first, but there was a whole he changed the pitch. That became the norm very quickly, the way he pitched. I mean, Brainerd pitched the same way for the Red Stockings. But
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I believe when the Excelsiors went around the place that they were playing clubs, so they'd never encountered the idea that the pitcher was like trying to get the ball past you at all.
That's pretty much true. Yeah.
And felt it was unsporting almost to be trying
So
to
you see
get it.
what we're talking about, the rules changes. You have Creighton somehow pitching in a way that nobody can handle. So what do you do as the batter when there's no strike zone? Like, he's basically broken this agreement that you let them hit it. So the batters started leaving the bat on their shoulders. This is where the strike zone ultimately comes from. And there are accounts where they're counting Creighton's pitches, 89 pitches in an inning, 350 in a game. These things happened.
Wow.
Crazy. So this is upsets the whole balance in baseball, the whole structure of the game. So you've got the batter's refusing to swing, and there are accounts of this. Henry Chowick complained about it, the waiting game tactic. So now you call warning strikes. And it's hard to get the umpires to do it. So it takes a few years. And then you call more of them. And then some of the pitchers refuse to throw the ball over the plate. So now you have warning balls. I mean, this is the progress that ends up with the strike zone. And baseball is all about the strike zone, as is obvious to everyone here. And it also is the thing that makes it watchable on television. So I'm having trouble imagining how you could have a bigger impact on baseball than James Creighton, or if you want to say James Creighton and his movement.
Let's get one more question in here. This one's from Bruce Allardyce. We're getting all the representation from the Proto Ball folks today. How did Brooklyn's 1860s prosperity compare to New York City? Did relative prosperity connected with potential leisure time and potential ticket buying impact baseball's growth in Brooklyn? Any one of you who wants to jump on that?
Wow, I mean, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, the class picture, the social class picture is very complicated. I kind of try to sort it out in my book. I don't think it was, I mean, New York was much wealthier than Brooklyn during this period. I'm not really sure how, the money really comes into it. You need leisure, and I think when we were talking about baseball's ambition, it was Chadwick that saw that you had to follow the people with the leisure, and those people with certain values and a certain amount of social status. This is why, like, a lot of historians are confused about the status of the Knickerbockers, because they weren't old money rich. They were upwardly mobile, and those people had to be sold on baseball, the legitimacy of it. And I think that's part of the ambition that Chadwick really saw, that's what baseball wanted to hitch its wagon to.
I think we're just about wrapping, we're just about out of time, right, Peter?
What about
muted,
the Creighton question?
Creighton question. Oh, the one at the very end here. Peter just asked? I read that Creighton died from internal bleeding or some other injury caused by a particularly violent swing while batting, but hearing about all the pitches he threw, is it possible that also contributed to his injury?
Can I recommend that you tune in tomorrow?
All right,
you have about 10 minutes.
Oh, we have to. Oh, we're going the full hour. Okay, sorry. I thought we were going 15 minutes.
We're going to go to full hour.
All right, great.
I'll get it shortened the next break.
John Thorne asked a question and then answered it himself, and I'd love for you guys to expound upon it. But what about Brooklyn made it the birthplace of baseball? Answer: gambling, then spectators who only had a rooting interest. Let's talk about gambling a little bit. Any one of you wants to take that? Bill?
Well, I mentioned that earlier. I said it shows that the sport was important. And you look at the other sports that were around at that time. gambling was the predominant part of it. I mean, horse racing, boxing, the purpose of doing it was basically gambling.
Mhm.
And when baseball came around, it was probably the first sport on which there was a lot of gambling, but people actually liked watching the game itself. You know, how many people would watch horses running around the circle if you couldn't bet on them? So, you know, the gambling, and then that, you know, the Atlantic Excelsior imbroglio of 1860, it showed baseball had sort of arrived. I mean, when the gamblers follow you, and it was an almost impossible thing to stop. You know, Chadwick for years wanted to get rid of the gamblers. So many people wanted to get rid of the gamblers. You know, today, I mean, we have legalized sports betting today. They just gave up trying to get rid of gambling, you know, and try to control it. So it clearly showed baseball had arrived. They have pool selling everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's all true, and I think we don't know the full extent of how intermatch gambling in baseball were because of the fact that gambling wasn't respectable and people like Chadwick were campaigning against it. So I think that drives it into the shadows. You know, you read about the 1868 Atlantics tour, and there's that story Jack Chapman told about getting into a fight on the railroad train. Somebody attacked the Atlantics, but they had all these boxers and bookies with them and tough guys. And they won this fight very easily. It's a funny story, and you're just saying, they're crossing the country with an entourage of bookies, gamblers, and criminals, some of which have things like murder raps. And gee, why would those people be on this trip? I mean, they were betting on themselves and manipulating odds, no question.
And
But I
suddenly,
think
in 1919, that's the wrong thing to do.
yeah. This is a real complicated question, but I do think that we all know there's fan identification as a psychological and cultural phenomenon apart from gambling. I mean, they can overlap. But that's the thing that was new in Brooklyn, and that's the thing that in 1860, I think people like Chadwick and the other journalists didn't quite appreciate.
Sure.
Like they assumed that passion meant they must have had money at stake. You know the Jerry Seinfeld bit about rooting for laundry.
Right. And
Right.
that's so true, right? Because as John said, it started with gambling, then it moved on to spectators who only had a rooting interest. And I think that rooting interest, like I mentioned in my presentation earlier, I think that rooting interest is grounded in the hometown fandom. You know, it's a piece that's missing from Major League Baseball today. Because you have players from all over the world, right? But you literally had Brooklyn teams that were made up of people who were from Brooklyn. So, you know, if you had a club that had more guys from your neighborhood on it, you were more inclined to root for that club. The rise of the popularity of it started to feed into sort of that human instinct to root for your own.
Right, and you know, in that 1870 game we were talking about with the Red Stockings and Atlantics, if you read the Daily Eagle the next day after the Atlantics have upset this monster that went 84-0 over parts of 3 seasons, they don't actually say. They don't make a point of the Red Stockings being paid as such because the Atlantics were paid. They were paid a share of the gate. They were paid more than the Red Stockings on a seasonal basis. But what the Eagle objects to is that what they find ugly is that the Red Stockings are what they call mercenaries from the 4 corners of the country. They have no relationship to Cincinnati. And they say our guys, they might be getting paid, but they all grew up in Brooklyn and in Brooklyn youth clubs, and they're Brooklyn boys. Yeah. So yeah, talk about an idea with a long momentum.
There's an interesting skeptical editorial in that same issue where the guy purely thinks the only reason this happened is because the Red Stockings knew that if they lost one, the odds would get better on them in future games.
Well, such things happen.
False note there in that whole glorious issue of the Eagle.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's disturbing if it's true, and it's disturbing if that was widely suspected, right? Yeah. Both those, we don't know to what degree it was one or the other. But remember when the Washington Nationals lost in Chicago in a tournament in 1867, they were upset by Spalding and a bunch of teenagers. They had to publicly defend themselves from charges that they'd thrown it to manipulate the odds. So the public was pretty cynical at that point.
That was interesting. And that Cincinnati Atlantic game is that the Cincinnati being on salary and the Atlantic's getting a share of the gate. When they were tied after 9 innings, Cincinnati wanted to continue on and Atlantics did not. And supposedly because they knew they would play it off the next day, get another gate, get another share. Whereas the Cincinnati just out their monthly check. So it's their advantage, the Atlantic's advantage to get the tie, get another gate in.
That's a really good point.
Just to,
you have about 5 minutes. Why don't you just hit the chat button and just pick out things that you may want to answer or have somebody in the panel.
well, I'm checking to see what other questions we have. Woody Eckert asked, I wonder why they didn't adopt the slow pitch softball arc rule. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. You know, the pitching before the Creighton Revolution was a lot like the pitching we use in my pickup game that I'm playing tomorrow morning. It's called modified fast pitch, but the idea is you don't have to arc it, but you just can't throw it over a certain speed. You can do anything else. Oh, I throw 38-mile-an-hour knuckleballs.
Eric Miklich mentions that was the unwritten rule.
Which was that they had to arc it?
I guess. Eric, can you clarify for us in the chat?
Oh, there's a good question. Irish immigration.
Slow pitching was the unwritten rule. Penelope asked, did Irish immigration to Brooklyn from 1850s on influence the growth of baseball?
It did on a delay, because in the amateur era, there's almost no foreign-born players. So, for instance, there's a lot of anachronism in normal history. The Atlantics had Pete O'Brien and Matt O'Brien, but they were born in the United States. Brooklyn had an Irish Catholic community that were, you know, the ones involved in baseball were the children of immigrants, like the political boss, Huey McLaughlin, who helped the Atlantics out. But the Irish learned to play baseball, but they did later. They did in the later part of the 19th century. And immigrants, you know, early amateur era baseball, immigrants, there were whole classes of people that were left entirely out of the picture. And one of them would be poor immigrants, laborers of any kind. And the very top of society wasn't interested in team sports. So it was kind of a narrow niche that baseball was going for initially.
You see occasional references to poorer people playing games on you know, what was called the East Side lands at the time, which is that sort of reservoir, Prospect Park area and stuff like that. People
Yeah, I'm sure they did, but
go out
you know,
and play games on Sundays, and now and then a Brooklyn Eagle reporter would stumble on it. And say, oh my God, baseball for poor people.
yeah, and they didn't have a lot of leisure, right? And so
Right.
No matter how good you were, if you were a laborer, you could never go on an Excelsior's tour. You didn't have the time.
Yeah, and then
fact,
and then
one
the
or
only
two of
time
the
they had was
Excelsiors didn't.
Sundays, which was officially frowned upon anyway.
Yeah, people were arrested for playing baseball on Sunday.
I find that a fascinating subject. I wish someone would write a book about the influence of blue laws on Brooklyn baseball and New York baseball in general.
Oh, yeah, I wonder if someone has, because you know, it's there's, when you're going back in time, there's always the tendency to be sort of presentist about things, but you forget how little leisure people had. You know, the whole idea that baseball came from the country to the city or vice versa. Yeah, Tommy Bond was born in Ireland. Almost every exception to what I just said, that baseball was 98%, 99% native born. Almost all the exceptions were exceptions for a reason. Like Al Reach coming from England when he was 1. You know, in other words, he wasn't really an Englishman. It was a technicality that he was born in. He grew up in Greenpoint. Yeah, and there were a couple of converted cricketers who were Irish and English. But I mean, overwhelmingly, you're talking about native-born Protestants. That's over 95% of the people who played in the early and middle amateur era.
Because we also got Harold Wright born in England.
Might that have had an influence on the blue laws?
I didn't quite catch that.
Repeat that, David?
So might that have had an influence on the blue laws, that the game was largely played by Protestants, but it was Catholic churches that were...
Well, it's funny because when the conflict over that happened in places where there were, say, German Catholics, and German and Irish Catholics had a more permissive idea about what to do on Sunday. So, right, in places like Cincinnati, where there are a lot of Germans, they're more open to Sunday baseball. When, you know, in the professional era. So these when the Protestant clergy was unbelievably powerful in New York and Brooklyn in the 1850s and 60s, and they would lobby hard for the police to shut down baseball games or anything.
I'm I'm gonna
I'm gonna-
have to, if we were doing this live, we would all be carrying this conversation to the bar after this was over at 6 o'clock. But I'm gonna have to cut us all off. Peter's given me the time finger here. So thank you all very much. Tom Gilbert, David Dyte, Bill Ryczek, thank you so much for your contribution to this conversation today. I was pleased to get a chance to speak to the three of you.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
This could go on for another couple of hours. But I want to leave you with one thought. I think Bill Ryczek said it maybe best. And maybe that's the criteria. If not Brooklyn, where? So that might be the question, the key question. So thank you, Ralph, for the wonderful discussion. And
Yeah, good job.
to all of the panelists, it was, what can I say? It was great.